Why do they hate us so much? What is this fixation with Israel?
There has been an indoctrination and a miseducation of, I think, an entire generation that believes that, yes, that Palestinianism is the key issue. And find me one Palestinianist protest in the West where they fly, yes, of course, they fly the flags of the Palestinians, they fly Hezbollah, Hamas flags, and flags of the Iranian Revolutionary Government, but they will never fly the flag of the country they're in. And this tells us everything.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Western Spirit. Today is my great honor and privilege to welcome Douglas Murray. Douglas is a renowned author and commentator whose new book on Democracies and Death Cults, Israel and the Future of Civilization, is now being in Hebrew, coming out. So by Shiboret of Sela Meir. So Douglas, first of all, congratulations on the book coming out in Hebrew here in Israel. And secondly, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you and your listeners.
So Douglas, I want to ask you a question that I think is a lot to do with your new book. During the past few months, as an Israeli looking outward, we've seen, I was going to talk with you about what we've seen just in the past month or so. The Eurovision contest has decided that next week they'll say if they're going to allow Israel to be in the contest or throw us out. UEFA of the European Soccer Football League is going to do the same. They're going to vote whether to kick us out of the football league. So Maccabi Tel Aviv and Hapoel Haifa will be kicked out if they decide the Israeli soccer teams will be kicked out. The Spanish prime minister insinuated that he would like to throw an atomic bomb at Israel to stop the atrocities in Gaza. And obviously, there's a lot more, but obviously the whole Palestinian recognition at the UN where you just were stuck in traffic. So I guess my question to you is, why do they hate us so much? What is this fixation with Israel? I know this is one of the main themes of your book, so maybe just water it down for us. I know you can't go through the whole book now.
There are, I think, two particular things going on. One is something that Secretary of State Marco Rubio actually referred to this past week, when he said accurately that the countries like my own country of birth, Great Britain, France, Canada, Australia, that their otherwise meaningless, certainly futile announcement that they were going to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state is really a reflection not of their abilities on the international stage or their ability to affect anything in the Middle East. After all, the era in which countries like Britain and France could create states is, I think, well regarded and known to be over. What Secretary of State Rubio said was that this comes from the fact that these countries have all taken in very large immigrant populations in recent years. Very considerable amounts of them are from the Muslim world, and they've brought their domestic bigotries with them, including the antisemitic bigotries, which even mainstream Muslims will admit is a preoccupation of their communities, very sadly. And Marco Rubio's observation was that these arrivals have come either themselves or their parents, and they have brought their obsession with the Jews and the Jewish state with them, and that to that extent, people like Mark Carney, Keir Starmer, and others are simply reacting to a domestic audience that is virulently anti-Semitic in very large parts and obsessed with Israel. And I think that's a very important factor in it. I think there's one other factor, though, which perhaps gets less attention, although, as you know, I address it in the book as well, which is what I regard as and describe as the religion of Palestinianism. That is, people who've been ill-educated, badly educated into the belief that you might sum it up in a slogan like, no one is free until Palestine is free. As if, I don't know, to put it at its most ludicrous, but it does come up like this, a trans person in New York cannot be free until the Palestinians have a state. I see, by the way, along these lines, rather, you've got to take your laughs where you can these days, that the Greta Thunberg flotilla has had a fallout because there aren't enough LGBTQIA plus people on the flotilla. Personally, I would love the flotilla to be filled with LGBTQIA Palestinian activists, and I'd like to see them land in Gaza and be welcomed it would be welcomed in traditional fashion by the locals. Um, but um, this erroneous belief that that Palestinians and the right of Palestinians to a state is the pressing international and indeed domestic concern really can be summed up by nothing else than that it is a kind of religion. Nobody is from one week to the next marching through New York or London or Toronto or Sydney demanding that the Kurdish people have a state, although the Kurdish people have much more of a right to a state, as far as I can see, and a much better justification for a state than the Palestinians, because the Palestinians, of course, been offered a state repeatedly and repeatedly rejected it, whereas the Kurds have done an enormous amount of good, an enormous amount of fighting on the side of the West, of course, not least against ISIS. But nobody says that. Like, nobody says nobody is free until northern Cyprus is free from the Turkish occupation. These things don't appear from not just one year to the next, but one decade to the next as major international themes. But there has been an indoctrination and a miseducation of, I think, an entire generation, really, that believes that, yes, that Palestinianism is the key issue. And that's why they, go to university and instead of studying, will live in a tent and holler about the Jewish state. And they find meaning in their lives like this, it seems. They've trodden it. This is where the religion of the West, that was the traditional religion of the West, has largely evaporated from the public space.
Yeah.
We all knew there were going to be consequences from that. But one is that you get new religions, and this is a new religion. And it's even got its own holy garb, the wearing of the kafir, and, the proper pronunciation of Palestine, and all these things.
Can I just one thing, just because up until October 7th, or maybe behind the scenes, it was also there, obviously, but there was another important cause. Every time there was another important cause for the same type of people. So until October 7th, as someone whose family still lives in New York, where I think you are now, we saw the BLM stuff. So you had to have the black box on your Instagram,
Yeah,
and you had
yeah,
to, and before that, there was the trans flag that whoever didn't have it wasn't part of the
yeah.
in religion.
And,
So
and whenever there's not a very, very proximate one, the climate
yes,
emergency can
exactly.
always come in as the latest, religion.
It's just a religion, you think, or is there something? There's what is like one of the things when Ayan Hirsi Ali was on our show, and I know you really appreciate her and you speak about her a lot. Was she said to me that this alliance between the Green Red Alliance, she calls it, she said the Greens know what will be once they tear down Western civilization. They know they have the Islamic Caliphate. They're going to kill all the non believers. Everyone's going to be under Sharia law. The red people have literally no idea what will be. These people on college campuses, what will be. The only thing for sure is that they'll be eaten by the green ones. How do
Mm.
you like? How do you? Is it just stupidity? What's you spoke about also the madness of crowds, I think, about this type of like madness of tons of people thinking the same stupid ideas.
Yeah, well, it's, there have been lots of iterations of this, I think, of the post 9/11 period, where actually I wrote some of my first pieces as a journalist about the curious coalition of the, vegans for peace walking alongside the halal meat eaters, and, queers for justice marching alongside people who would throw them off buildings. So that's not a new thing.
Right.
That's been around for some decades, actually, now. Usually, the expectation is that it falls apart under the weight of its own contradictions. But as I pointed out in Madness of Crowds, an important thing to get from the sort of the red bit of it is that the Marxists and the post-Marxists and the people who don't realize they're Marxists don't mind contradictions in the way that you and I might mind them. So you and I might mind that this seems to be unsolvable as an alliance, but Marxists very often see insoluble things as simply another thing to solve, and contradiction is not a problem.
Yes.
Um, but I do think that most of these groupings, they, I mean, I always say that the anti-Israelism is the first bit of it, But it really always boils down to the same thing, which is the hatred of the West in general. And I mean, you see that just the other week here in America, there was a conference of Palestinian activists, and one of them
Yes.
said on stage, one of our key things is we have to destroy the idea of America. We have to destroy the idea that America is good. Um, that is literally what they believe. They believe that Israel is a colonialist, settler, white supremacist, genocidal, ethno state, Nazi, blah, blah, blah. But they believe the same thing about Canada, Britain, France, Australia, America. They believe it about all of these things as well. And I have this shorthand for this that I've tried to popularize in recent years, which is find me a pro Israel demonstration in the West, outside of Israel, and people will be flying the Israeli flag and the flags of the country they're in. And they will usually sing Hatikva at the end and also the national anthem of the country they're in. Find me one Palestinianist protest in the West where they fly, yes, of course, they fly the flags of the Palestinians, they fly Hezbollah, Hamas flags, and so on, flags of the Iranian Revolutionary Government, but they will never fly the flag of the country they're in. And this tells us everything, absolutely everything. There has not been a Palestinianist protest in London that has finished with the singing of God Save the King. Whereas the pro-Israel ones always finish with the national anthem and Hatikva. Why would the Palestinianist ones not finish with the singing of God Save the King? Because they don't want God to save the King, and they don't like the United Kingdom. In Washington, D.C., if you have an anti-Israel demonstration, the only American flags around will be the ones that they've torn down from flagpoles to burn on the street.
Yes.
So this is the very big tell that anyone with eyes should not just notice, but learn from.
Right. So, and that it seems so obvious what you're saying, and yet we see, for example, in the UK and Canada and France, all these leaders who see this, and either they're very cowardly, so they want to win the next immediate election, and they're willing to jeopardize the entire future, or they're stupid. There's really no other way to read this, where they're just giving in to the mob when the mob is just the appetite is going to grow with other things that might not have to
Yeah.
do with Israel, right?
Well, yes. I mean, I'll give you an example. In February 2024, January or February 2024, the workings of the British Parliament were disrupted and altered because there was a large Palestinianist protest happening outside that became very intimidating against members of Parliament. And so parliamentary procedure changed. The then Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, said in a subsequent set of remarks, rather strange, but emergency remarks on the steps of Downing Street, that it was coming to seem like the rule of democracy was going to be replaced by the rule of the mob. He said that, and absolutely nothing happened as a consequence. But anyone with eyes and a voice that's courageous should be able to notice that and comment on it. But a lot of them don't. A lot of the members of parliament and others don't. I suspect that Keir Starmer and Mark Carney and others think they've bought themselves some time, and they may have done. I mean, all of these parties of the left that have announced Palestinian statehood are all parties that have a wing of their party or a break-off wing which threatens them electorally. For instance, in Britain, it's the so-called Gaza independents who were elected to parliament in the election last year. Just imagine for a moment, by the way, how bizarre it is and what a terrible indictment of the sectarian politicking that now goes on in Great Britain, that people will be standing for parliament and win a seat as Gaza independents. Like, what the hell has it got to do with them? What's it got to do with someone in the middle of England? Absolutely nothing. So these people presumably think that electorally they've done something clever, or at least have bought themselves some time. The real reason why they don't address it is, going back to the Marco Rubio point, is that if they were to address it, it would be very difficult and very divisive and maybe dangerous. You would have to, for instance, do what the Trump administration is doing in the US and forcibly deport foreign criminals and agitators who shouldn't be in your country. But I don't see any likelihood at the moment that the Starmer administration is going to do that in the UK or any of their counterparts. And so the problem will just grow. And they know that that's a problem, but they put it off for their successors, at which point the problem is worse.
Yes, I want to ask you exactly about Europe in a minute, but I want to first ask you about the your relationship with Israel vis-a-vis October 7th and your book. And I guess the first question I would like to ask about that is when October 7th happens, and I've heard you describe in Times Square, I think it was, where this protest
Mm.
happens on October 8th. And when did you decide that you were coming to Israel? How did you make the decision, and what did you find when you first came here?
Well, I've been to Israel many times over the years for work and also for holiday, as it happened. And so I'm pretty familiar with the country, many friends there. I woke up on the 7th, like everyone, to messages from friends as well as news alerts telling me what was going on. And yes, the next day I heard there was a protest in Times Square, and I went to it because I wanted to observe it and record it. And it was an anti-Israel protest of people screaming about the Jewish state as the massacre was still going on in the south of Israel. And that was, I suppose, several things came to my mind. One was just an instinctive need to be there, and the second was that I knew that the world was going to try to pass over the events of the 7th very swiftly. And I wanted to be able to see with my own eyes what had happened and collect the stories from people who had survived or had been affected. And I wanted to do that because I didn't want the world to be able to pass over the 7th and simply go on to an obsession with Israel's response. And so, and then a third thing was I wanted to be there for Israel's response and follow that in Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere as closely as possible. But it was also, I knew from the beginning, before I even realized that there was going to be a book that I was going to have to write about this, I realized that the two things were what was happening in Israel, but then what has happened to the rest of the world. That its response could include things like, groups in the UK putting in their petitions for public protests the next day on the day of the 7th of October. What was it that we were about to see? And so the book is a reflection, an account of what I saw, a reflection on the massacre and on the war, but also a reflection and tries to be an explanation of what it is that happened outside of Israel that made the response so appalling, the response that meant that the victims were victimized a second time over. And that's really what I sort of instinctively just knew I had to do. And I am, as a writer, I am dedicated always to the idea that you should see things with your own eyes, see them up close. And not just because that's your duty as a journalist and a writer, but because without that, you can't really understand the full scale of what you're talking about. And sometimes that's hearing the stories of survivors in the hospitals and visiting the morgues of Tel Aviv and so on. Sometimes it's speaking to people who did unbelievably heroic things on the day and trying to bring their stories out, because there's a lot of amazing stories I tell in the book of just unbelievable heroism and
Yeah.
superhuman things that people did to save lives on the day. But it's also necessary, to be able to accurately understand the response, and to that extent, I don't sugarcoat any of it, but to relate some of what I saw in Gaza, and Lebanon, and elsewhere, and I hope I bring that to the reader as clearly and as forcefully as I can.
Douglas, if you had to look at I know this is a tough question as someone looking in from the outside into Israel, but a lot of inside Israel, with the way people are talking, and maybe a lot of what I'm saying too, is there's a lot of criticism of the government and the way it presented our case to the world. And my
Mm.
question is, do you think that if it was done differently, if it was done quote unquote better, if we spoke the language of the woke left better, for example, would they have been a little less hateful to us? Does it matter? Does it matter at this point how you speak to them because they'll hate us anyway, or could it have been done differently?
You know, Israel is a country of about 9 million people who have 9 million
Yes.
uh, people who know best how to explain Israel's case. And it's a country of about 8 million would be prime ministers. Um, it's always going to be the case. It's always going to be that people have criticisms. I would observe a couple of things. Firstly, the first war in Israel I covered was the 2006 Lebanon war, and the difference in terms of Israel managing to get its facts out is infinitely better in the last couple of years than it has been in any previous war. In 2006, you had to wring, like it's like getting blood out of a stone, to get information from the army about what they were doing and why certain things had happened, and you know, this war, I think that the communication from the IDF and others has been about as good as it can be. There have been failings, as there always are, but I think that Israel has got its point of view out much more, much faster and better than ever before. Doesn't mean it can't improve, but um, as for getting the sort of wider case out, you know, as I say at one point in the book, look at something like something that a lot of liberal Israelis and others think is a sort of brilliant move is to highlight, say, the fact that Israel has equal rights for gays, okay? Has a pride parade every year in Tel Aviv.
Yes.
They think that that will help Israel's international reputation. Of course, the Muslim world also hates Israel for that. But the non Muslim world, America and so on, have a term for this now, invented by a very idiotic pseudo academic in the US, which is pinkwashing. They say, the only reason the Israelis have gay rights is because they want to distract us from their genociding of the Palestinians. And so mention something like equal rights, and that too will be used as an attack. It'll be said to be totally unimportant because Israel is genociding. And you can do that on everything. You can point to the religious freedom, and you know, somebody will say, well, that's all just a diversion from your desire to genocide the Palestinians. Um, it's a sort of no win on that. And you know, can Israel get its case out better? Yes, always. But at some level as well, I've come to just realize that, look, it's a numbers game. There are 1.6 billion or so Muslims in the world, the majority of whom, if you look at any polls, have negative views about Israel and the Jewish people. And as I say, there's like, what, 15, 16, 18 million Jews in the world, you know, and that's just vastly outnumbered. Now, the challenge, of course, is to be able to address, speak to, correct the mistakes of well-meaning people who are not Jewish around the world. But I think that, which is way beyond the scope of any Israeli government or anything to affect, that is something which the other Western countries have to admit within their own midst. The miseducation, the maleducation that has swept through America, Britain, Canada, Australia, is a result of universities and schools even that teach erroneous history, or, which is just as bad, pretend that that's something you should be doing in school or university. I mean, I'm sitting in New York State at the moment. In New York State, K through 12, students at public schools have about a 50% chance of leaving school functionally illiterate and functionally innumerate.
Yes.
So why are they being taught about the Middle East and one of the most intractable and complex questions imaginable? Why are students at university being persuaded that they know how to solve a conflict which has evaded the solutions of countless very brilliant politicians inside Israel and outside? You know, they might notice, you know, Bill Clinton didn't manage to solve the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. Tony Blair spent years living in the region, going around everywhere. He hasn't solved it. why would a first year student at Columbia University solve it? And the answer is they don't, they can't. But this is where you get into one of the big problems, which is the combination that has been taught across the West of considerable ignorance, allied with unbelievable narcissism,
Yes.
which is, I know how to solve this problem. And they don't. And they make no meaningful contribution to it, and end up being effectively the voices of Hamas. Um,
Yes.
it's tragic, but that's a miseducation issue which America must solve, Britain and other countries must solve. It's not, I think, in the ability of any. The Israeli government could, to a man and a woman, be the most fluid English-speaking, clear explainers of the situation, and that wouldn't solve
Yeah.
um, the problem of the miseducation outside.
It's so depressing because it might be a problem in the US or in UK or in any other European country, but we are going to be suffering from it. Meaning, as of now,
Mm.
the only country that still supports us on the let's say in the UN Security Council, the only country that's willing to veto all these really and stupid and I would say even evil resolutions, pro Hamas resolutions in the UN Security Council, is the US. And Democrats, I think, have like a 5% approval rating of Israel right now.
Mm.
So we're basically down to one party in America that still supports us. And as of now, at least in all of Europe, maybe it'll change. There's different parties that are rising up. We'll see. But as of now, the entire world seems to be turning their back. It might be an internal problem of each country, but it is definitely going to hurt us in the long run and even in the short run.
I think the job of Israel is to just survive and thrive. And if there's a football team in the UK who's called Millwall, and their slogan is "No one likes us, we don't care." Um, that's I don't think Israel can treat itself to that. I think they should care and never give up on trying to explain the errors of their haters. But really, all you can do is to show by example, and hope that people catch up. I mean, you mentioned uh, the key international issue of Eurovision earlier, um, a parade that makes the UN look serious. But you know, I mention it because look at what has happened there. We all know that, for instance, the last 2 years of that have been dogged by anti-Israel activists.
Yeah.
But just look at what I loathe things like Eurovision. I have no interest in them, and that's because I like music. But in the last 2 years, look at the interesting thing of the Israeli entries, and I think particularly of the one 2 years ago. What's her name? Who
Eden
sang?
Golan.
Yeah, she she was remarkable because not only is she very beautiful, has a beautiful voice, and had a good song, but all these screaming maniacs were screaming at this beautiful Jewish girl singing beautifully. And I always remember the Irish entry in that year who kept saying that she wouldn't appear with the Israeli singer and so on. The Irish entry was a very, very hideous, scrawny Irish woman who calls herself queer, turns out to have a boyfriend. So she's just using queer as a way to say that she's a revolutionary of some kind. She dressed as a devil, literally had sort of horns
Yeah.
and piercings everywhere. And she looked absolutely hideous and behaved worse, and she kept sort of screaming, the queers are coming, and all this sort of thing. She was like a demon. And you might say, well, isn't it terrible that Eden Golan has to face this? And I go, but on the other hand, she did. And I think a lot of the world is watching that sort of thing and looking at the example and the difference of those two things. Would you rather be on the side of the beautiful girl who's got a lovely song, a lovely voice, or on the side of somebody who's a self-confessed demon? And if you decide to side with the second, good luck with what remains of your life.
I just want to also ask about this wave of political violence in America and how this, I think this in a way has to do with what we're talking about because all
Yeah,
these people are sort of the omni-cause. So I'm willing to put money that this guy that killed Charlie Kirk probably was supportive of Palestine. I'm willing to bet on it. If he was pro trans rights and he was pro and he had a trans boyfriend and he had all these ideas of him being hateful and therefore needing to stop him, I'm just willing to put it out there. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's usually I think this bet would be right, just as in a general sense. And then we see all these ICE facilities being bombed, and we saw the two Israeli embassy people being killed in
yeah,
Washington D.C. And this other thing in New Hampshire last week, I think it was, when the guy screamed "Free Palestine" and shot into this place.
yeah.
Um, and we see. And we obviously in the UK and all these other places also violence against anyone who is outwardly Jewish at this point.
Mm.
So how do you explain this? I think there's a willingness more than there was in the past to just use violence if you don't
Oh
like
yeah.
someone's opinion.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's grown exponentially, and again, the polls will show this. And it skews disproportionately young. The younger somebody is, the more likely they are to believe that violence is an acceptable a resort to solve political disagreement. And that to say that that's unfortunate is to massively understate the situation. Again, it's something you just have to get through. People point to things like the killer of the United Healthcare executive in New
Yes.
York, gunned down. A father and a husband was gunned down on Sixth Avenue in New York by this young, reprehensible guy, and people said things like, well, I mean, this is Elizabeth Warren, a US senator, said you can only push people so far, as if, you have critiques of the American healthcare system, easy to do, just like it's easy to have critiques of the NHS in the UK. You have critiques of the healthcare system, and some logical endpoint of that is that you shoot a healthcare executive in the streets of Manhattan. Now, so I mention this because the violence that we've seen in recent days and weeks, particularly the assassination of Charlie Kirk, is another extension of what seems to again be a very unfortunate thing that parts of Western society have decided, which is that you have to take things into your own hands, and I think that has happened because otherwise responsible politicians have. It's happened in part. Obviously, the responsibility is always on the individual,
Yes.
but it has also come about because there has been a ramping up of the rhetoric, um, and specifically on the political left. I have to say, all political sides can be responsible for this and do have their own nutters and crazies and so on. But at the moment, unfortunately, a part of the radical left has pushed this idea that their opponents are not simply wrong, but that they're evil,
Yeah.
and that they knowingly and willingly do evil, and that the Jewish state is knowingly evil and practicing evil, and that ICE in America is Nazis, and uh, that MAGA are fascists. And unfortunately, if you keep pushing that, you will get people, particularly young men, who will think that they can become a world historic figure by doing that thing of going back in time and killing Hitler.
Yes.
And unfortunately, if you keep calling people Hitler who are not Hitler,
Yes.
there will be people who will step up and shoot and kill.
Right.
And that's what we've seen. And it's absolutely a terrible thing to happen in a civilized democracy.
But how do you explain that, according to a few polls I've seen, most Democrats think that it's a right winger that actually shot Charlie Kirk?
Well, that's because, as I've often said, having different opinions is very 20th century. In the 21st century, we have different facts.
Yes.
Um, and, you know, prominent figures, Jimmy Kimmel being the rather obvious one in recent days, told their listeners that because the accused shooter, killer, murderer was from a Republican family, that this one's on Republicans. That's flat out false and misinformation, fake news, and whatever you want to call it. But that means that a significant portion of America has a different set of facts about what should be able to be agreed upon to be a just a terrible act of violence, which has to be condemned, and then understood for what this reprehensible young man might have been marinating in ideologically. But if you don't want to do that, then you're lost, completely lost, and you can't solve any problems. Yeah.
Douglas, I want to ask about the other side. So we've seen, I think I started really noticing that it's really a real thing when you went on Joe Rogan and debated, I don't know, how do you call it, with Dave Smith, who I never heard of before. You spoke with him on Joe Rogan. And the point that I took away from everything was that there's a segment of what's, I guess you can call, like, broadly speaking, the American right that really hates Jews. And it's not Israel, because maybe for Dave Smith it is, I don't know him personally, but it's when his stuff goes online and you just scroll through the comments on X, for example,
Mhm.
there's a significant, at least online faction of people who really hate Jews. And whether the people who are putting out this stuff against Israel are, and or saying we're anti-Zionist, not anti-Semitic, and then but the way it's being interpreted by everyone who reads their stuff, their own followers, is total Jew hatred. So, and just the last example
Yeah.
was Tucker's thing with the hummus eaters who killed Jesus. And
Mhm.
when he said that, I saw he sent a message to one of the people on one of the websites, and he said, "I never thought that this was even anything to do with Jews, but it was interpreted by everyone following it that it was Jews." How do you just look at, broadly speaking, the this phenomenon? This it's not new, but I didn't. Growing up in the U.S., I never thought this was so prevalent. And growing up as a
Well,
Hasidic Jew in New York,
I'm afraid that the rats are out of the sewer again.
yes,
To steal from Camus' The Plague, the rats are out of the sewer again, and that's why a formerly reasonable person like Tucker Carlson, in the aftermath of his friend's murder, starts claiming that the Jews did it,
yes,
that Israel has questions to answer. I'm like, this is sick, sick stuff. I mean, that is what a dishonor to a friend to do that. It's just so, so disappointing. But um, I'm afraid, yes, the rats are out of the sewer again, metaphorically speaking, and I think it's probably happened. It's a generational swing, and I think there is one, if I can say so, rather obvious explanation. I was speaking the other week in Montreal and met beforehand lovely man who came to introduce himself, 95-year-old Holocaust survivor called Maxwell Smart, and gave me a book that he wrote, a memoir. It's called The Boy in the Woods, and he hid in the woods in Ukraine throughout the war, and it was very moving talking with him. Very more moving as well to read his book afterwards, and but I did just think then again, yes, it's back because the generation of survivors is very close to dying out, and I think that since 1945, there was such a clear line held on anti-Semitism, on Jew hatred, and indeed on Holocaust denial and more, which was basically just that the very simple one is that the survivors were there. They were around. Anyone David Irving like figure would come against the reality of people who were still alive and
yes,
around. I think as that generation has died out, or is dying out, it's come back because they are not ashamed of it now,
yeah,
and they don't. And I mean, I devoted part of on Democracies and Death Cults to the question of anti-Semitism, which, as you know, I mean, I think of as a perennially interesting perennial problem. And my explanation, which I, as you know, I go into in the book, and I think I try to answer using Vasily Grossman as my guide is that anti Semites always tell us about themselves and nothing about the Jews. And whatever it is somebody accuses the Jews of is something that they are guilty of themselves. And this is true 100% of the time. Grossman, in his own era, of course, gives the example of Nazi anti Semitism, where the Nazis accused the Jews of being racists who wanted to take over the world. Uh, Almost as though it's projection,
Yes,
isn't it?
almost.
And in our day, um, people are accusing the Jewish state, the Jewish people, of things that they themselves are guilty of.
Yeah.
And this has to be countered, but it must always be countered fully, and with the knowledge that you might fail, that you'll certainly fail to ever put it underground forever. Um, but my view, my whole life has been that the problem of anti-Semitism is, of course, it's first of all a problem for the Jews, but it's the sign that your society is going wrong.
Yes.
But when people start doing that, when they start looking for the omni cause and it's the Jews, you just everything else is going to go rotten.
Yes.
That's why you see, when even a political side, the right, even people who were friends with Charlie Kirk, end up trying to suggest the Jews killed Charlie Kirk, everything else in their minds and in their worldview is going to be rotten as hell too.
Yeah.
And that's why I believe that Jews and non-Jews like me have a duty, an impulse to fight back against that, because otherwise everything is lost.
Yes. I want to ask you or tell you something just on a personal note. So before October 7th, how did I think I first saw you on some podcast or something that you were doing. And the reason why it caught my eye, so to speak, is that at the time I was losing my eyesight due to a very rare disease. And now I'm considered legally blind. And at the time, it was very disheartening. And it's very easy when something like that happens to someone in the middle of their life to just like give up and just like,
Mm,
you're not going to see anymore and life is going to be totally different. And I saw you on some podcast when you were talking about this entire younger generation that just wants to be a victim. And this was your
mm,
main, I don't remember exactly the context, but it doesn't really matter. You were putting out there that there's a sort of yearning by young people to show how everyone's
yeah,
a bigger victim than the other.
yeah.
And I was listening to you and I said, I have all the reasons in the world to be a victim because I'm a
Mm,
victim of life. But and you were saying how bad it is. I don't remember I just have to like tell you how appreciative I am of you at the time.
thank
I'm
you.
and I'm happy that I can tell you this personally because
Thank you. It
in a
means a great
way,
deal. Thank you.
what?
That means a great deal to me. Thank you.
So in a way it gave me a sort of, I'm not going to let this be. And I got
Hmm.
married and I have three children and I work in a print newspaper without seeing. I think I'm the last one, I'm the only one in the world that can do this. And so I wanted to thank you, and maybe you can just talk about, just to finish off our conversation, about just why, and maybe tie that into anti-Semitism also, because I think it has to do. When everyone's looking why they're a victim, they're looking for who's making them a victim.
Yes, yes, that's absolutely true. Um, I wrote about this a couple of books back in the War on the West, because I some years ago came to the conclusion that perhaps it's a rather grandiose point to make, but bear with me. Perhaps the greatest division uh, between human beings is between those who live lives of resentment and those who live lives of gratitude.
Yes.
I partly came to this conclusion through reading Nietzsche very carefully, because he makes the brilliant observation in The Genealogy of Morals that uh, people of resentment need somebody to stand over their life and say, someone has ruined your life, somebody has wrecked your
Yes.
chances, and the person is you. which is about the worst thing anyone can be told and the hardest thing for anyone to take in if it is the case. But one of the things I just noticed in my own life, fairly considerable travels around the world, is that you meet people often who have a lot or everything, who are incredibly resentful people. And you also meet people who have nothing, who live lives of grace and gratitude. And
Yes.
I've found this for many years to be a deeply perplexing and inspiring problem, an issue. And I think everybody joining us will probably know of both types of person in their own lives. You either live a life of resentment, and anything you don't have or that's gone wrong or has been difficult is someone else's fault, and they're keeping you down. And of course, the Jews are perfect in
Yes.
size and number and prominence to fill in that for any low IQ person, and some are high IQ ones as well. But the thing of being able to live in wonderment and gratitude is a gift that transcends any socioeconomic or other situation. And I think there has been an indoctrination of people into resentfulness, and I would like to turn that around and say just the whole thing's such a bloody miracle. It's so astonishing that we're here at all and have the opportunities we have. And I I just have never taken for granted, for instance, living in peace. It's one of the things that when you live in the realm of war, you have a special respect for.
Yes.
But lots of people who have only known peace have no idea how lucky they are and how rare this has been. And that's why the instinct to tear it all down, burn it all up, and then see what's on the other side is so lamentable.
Yeah.
Because on the other side of that, I know from history and observation what the likely outcomes are. So yes, I think to a great extent, but of course, one other ride on that. Never forget that the resentful person will be, among other things, resentful towards people who are grateful.
Yes.
They
And
will hate
yeah.
the person of gratitude
And can I
because
just tell you lastly one
yeah.
thing that, as you were saying, I was thinking of that you live in New York, or at least you said you were in New York State, and the mayor of New York City, who's probably going to win, his entire shtick
Hmm.
is resentfulness. His
Yep.
entire campaign is saying to people, "The system is against you. Vote for me.
Yes.
I will be against the system for you."
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
literally nothing of him, anything of his campaign that I've seen that says I'm grateful for living in America, coming from Uganda. My father has
yeah.
this great Columbia professorship. And it's like the only thing that he's selling is for people to being resentful, and the
Yes.
younger generation is buying it. It's so sad.
Well, I couldn't agree more. There are lots of people like Mamdani, lots of people who've done the same shtick, lots of people who have the same problems of understanding, which he obviously has. Um, it's tough.
Yeah.
I believe that, I mean, like New York is wildly expensive. It makes London seem cheap. Maybe the only city in the world as expensive as Tel Aviv. Um,
Yes.
you know, the thing is, there's no right to live in a great apartment in Manhattan, and it's always been expensive. It's always been a difficult city, and unfortunately, a lot of people can't make it, don't make it, but that's fine. There's plenty of you know places that are great, and New York just happens to be very expensive. But if you say to people that, it's not as popular as saying we need to make New York an affordable city, and we'll do that by rent controls and free supermarkets and things. I
Yes.
mean, yeah, but uninformed young people might well fall for that, and some older people who should know better as well. I hope they don't.
Yeah.
There's some other good candidates, but it looks like Mamdani will be mayor, and of course, the anti-Semitism is in
Yes.
there as
That
well.
always goes along with it. It's like a, like you said, the omni cause. I would just say that my father lives in New York, and I think that Jewish people in New York, especially people that grew up like me, I was a Hasidic Jew with the hat, the jacket, the beard, the whole thing. I would say that it is already dangerous, I think, in a lot of places to go like that. And I would say leave to Florida. What do you have to,
Well, I think that's what a lot of people will do.
yeah,
I think a lot of people will do that.
yeah.
And it'll be to the detriment of the city. There'll be a brain drain, a money drain, and yeah. But that's why people should turn out and vote for someone else.
God willing. Douglas Murray, I know we're taking up a little bit more than we said, but I really appreciate everything that you did. Your book's amazing. We're
Thank
going to tell our audience to buy the book. Our Hebrew speakers will get to read this in Hebrew in Globes. So go read that in Hebrew if you're better at that. And we'll have subtitles and everything. So really appreciate your time with us. You're an amazing
you.
person, an amazing ally. And I really appreciate everything you've done for me personally and for all of us here. So thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate you. It's been a great pleasure to have this opportunity. So thank you.